Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday again. Time feels like it's moving fast. I've had lots of game activity and getting some other game stuff up and running for later this week and various cool things happening, so that's all quite fun. Hello, the kids are asleep. Thanks for hanging out. So, there was been a really good, really positive response to the Candela Obscura quick start walkthrough that I did this last Friday, and I've been hanging out on various forums, and discords and things, and seeing how people are reacting to the game. And a really common theme that I noticed among some of the folks, not everybody, some of the folks who are in those conversations that I'm in those conversations with, is that there seems to be some challenges in expectations and a bit of a gap in understanding, or at least like people wrapping their heads around the kind of approach to GMing and some of the GMing philosophy that has become really standard and familiar to me as somebody who has mostly worked in the narrative game side of the RPG world. So whether we're calling that story games or fiction-focused games or anything like that, I'm mostly thinking about Powered by the Apocalypse games. That is games like Apocalypse World by Vincent and Mackay Baker, and then the Powered by the Apocalypse framework, which they outlined. PBTA and PBTA becoming a thing in the way that Forged in the Dark became a thing is a bit of its own story. It's not directly my story, and I don't have all the details, but it's interesting. But Forged in the Dark is what I have mostly been running for my longer term games. Like I have a Start Playing Games table on Mondays that plays in the Dark, and I am running Court of Blades in Valorword for Speculate, and had run Rebel Crown and other things like that. So this is Forged in the Dark specifically is like my main focus and specialty. It is what I'm using to design the Genrenauts RPG, which is kind of in various processes. Fingers crossed for good news on that. Would be lovely. And since I find so much commonality between Candela Obscura and Forged in the Dark designs, Blades in the Dark and others, as we've now seen in the revised Quick Start Guide, where Darrington Press specifically calls out Blades in the Dark as a major inspiration. That was just kind of putting the actual words on existing influence, because there's never been any active concealment in any of that. So if you're coming to Candela Obscura from mostly playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there's understandably going to be some adjustment. And what I want to do in this video is give as much help to folks who are in that situation as I can, and hopefully along the way provide some other useful or at least interesting thoughts about GMing and game design for folks who aren't in that position, whether you have already played Forged in the Dark games or other kind of narrative-focused games or more rules-like kinds of games. I'm just going to talk about how I see GMing philosophy for these games and hope that it's useful. So many of my notes are just right here, right? What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to make this even bigger, because that will let me just focus on a few things at once. Okay? So the first thing that I think is important to do in this kind of a conversation is to talk about what the fiction means, because in a lot of the games in this tradition, people talk about the fiction, focus on the fiction moves forward, begin and end with the fiction. So the fiction, as I see it, is, or a fancy way of saying it is it's the diegesis. It is the corpus of the story. It is what's happening in the game in the moment that we are focusing on as the group, right? If in like an actual play, and I'm describing something that's happening in the world of Valorword, that is the fiction. The fiction is your characters are on the roof, on the like terrace garden cafe, and you have a bottle of wine in a bucket of ice in front of you, and the the attendant, the server, has just walked up to ask what you would like, and then threw off their costume and revealed that they're an assassin. That's the fiction. If someone then asks, hey, should I have 3 stress? I thought I got rid of all this stress. That's not the fiction. Because we have stepped outside of what is happening in the narrative world. The shared imagined space is another way that gets talked about in TTRPG, like academic framework. So the fiction doesn't have to be a fancy thing. It's just what's happening in the story world. And so when designers talk about beginning and ending with the fiction, the idea is that our collective attention in play should be focused on the fiction. We should be thinking about the context and the situation and the emotions of the story as it is happening, right? So another distinction we could make would be that, like, fiction is all of the stuff that happens, and then the story is the way that we put it all in a sense of order and give it meaning, right? The king died and then the queen died isn't a story. The king died and the queen died of grief becomes much more of a story. That's an aphorism or a saying that I've picked up from somewhere, and unfortunately I don't remember the specific attribution because it's already a permutation. But the important thing with the fiction is that in Forged in the Dark games and a lot of games that are similar, we look to the fiction to help us do a lot of the king died and then the queen died is in news reports. That's a rude, no, accurate. We judge what's going on in the fiction to evaluate how we should apply and interpret the rules and the mechanics of the game, right? In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, we do some of this as well. And, per writing and the GM advice that's already in books. But in D&D 5th edition, my character being really angry in the fiction doesn't matter mechanically unless I am a barbarian who is raging, or unless I have some other mechanics that matter. There's not, in my experience, as much in practice or in mechanical guidance or instruction for the GM to consider all the contours of the fiction in adjudicating what's happening. In a game that is more granular and more structured, like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is compared to some other games, there's a lot of specific rules already to use to interpret what's going on and how to think about things. In a more rules-light game or a more narrative-focused game, rather than having a lot of charts or like a big breakdown of like, here's your base attack bonus, and this enemy is this large, and so it's harder or easier to hit them because this is what it says on page 173 of the monster manual. We don't really have that. If in Candela Obscura your characters are facing off against a vampire, that vampire doesn't have stats, right? I'm not expecting that in the main Candela Obscura book there's going to be a monster manual section, because I don't know that Darrington is designing it to be that kind of a game. It could be. All we have is the quick start guide, so I don't know. But I'm guessing that we're not going to have that. But what you will know is that in this scene, your investigators are in the dining room of the vampire's mansion. Nobody else knows where they are. The vampire has minions waiting just outside the door to the dining room, and the vampire is substantially stronger than anybody in the group. And so when the vampire reaches out to grab the magician character and hold them up by their neck, we will know from the fiction, as the GM describes it and as the GM kind of remembers in their own mind what they expect things to be, that a character being held aloft by a vampire who is substantially stronger than them means that in the fiction, that character is in a bunch of trouble. And if their player says, oh, okay, well, I want to punch the vampire and get out of their grip, there isn't a rule that says vampires have 7 strength and occultists have 3. So we don't have that framework to compare to help us do judgment. We have to think in terms of the fiction. Part of why I think these games really work for me is because I approach them as a novelist, as a storyteller, where I have spent a lot of time developing my storytelling skills in both TTRPGs and in other formats, right? Because I started playing TTRPGs before I got serious about writing and becoming a novelist. So I've been doing that work. If a Candela Obscura character wants to use one of their skills to get away from the vampire, say that they want to use Strike. I'm just going to pull up the Candela Quick Start character sheets to make sure that I'm remembering. Yes, Strike is one of the actions. So if the magician says, I want to use Strike to clock the vampire in the face so that they drop me. As the GM, I would look at that and go, okay, well, you have 2 in Strike, and so you're a skilled pugilist. We've established this in the fiction. However, the vampire has super strength because vampires in this world we're establishing for this game are substantially stronger than people and substantially tougher. So it may be really hard to punch a vampire so powerfully that they drop you to the floor unless they want you to be on the floor. And so I keep the fiction in mind as the GM, and I will say, okay, I think this is a high stakes role. And I think that if you succeed, you're not automatically going to be dropped to the floor, but the vampire will loosen their grip, and that will create an opportunity for you or for someone else to exploit. That would be a way of using the fiction to inform your judgment as the GM in a role. Now, this creates a bit of a challenge because most of the time in Forge in the Dark games, you don't need to do multiple rolls to achieve one thing. You roll once and you do the thing. You roll to overcome an obstacle. But then how do you make that fit with an obstacle that is incredibly difficult, right? You're either going to say that it's really, really unlikely to happen, or that it's going to take an extraordinary result to happen, or it's going to take several attempts to happen. Yep. High stakes roll. I didn't even think about that, Triffity Mats. I was so focused in. You're absolutely right. It's a good bit. So props. If instead the magician character had a stake on hand and said, aha, this is exactly what I wanted because now the vampire has gotten me close to them and one of their hands is already occupied. So I pull out the stake and I slam it into the vampire's chest. Maybe it's still going to be high stakes, but that may go a lot better for them, right? Because they're establishing in the fiction that they have a tool that is way more likely to be successful. Rather than I punch the vampire to get them to drop me, it becomes I stake the vampire to get them to drop me. And then maybe we're establishing that in this world, vampires are paralyzed when they're staked. They're not killed, but they're paralyzed. And okay, well, if they're paralyzed, then you should be able to get yourself out of their grip without having to make another roll. The risk and the uncertainty is in, can you stake them? Can you, a mere mortal, act in such a way that surprises and strikes a vampire who is, a powerful immortal? So another thing to think about with the fiction is that the fiction will help you identify what your consequences are going to be if there is a consequence from a roll, either from getting a 1 to 3 as the result, or a consequence on a mixed hit, right? A 4 or a 5. In this situation where I have my magician being held by the vampire, if I am going to try to do punch and I get a consequence, the consequence could be really bad because I'm already vulnerable to this vampire by being held aloft by them. So it could be like direct harm that the vampire, you hit the vampire, but the punch doesn't, barely moves them at all. Their face is still perfect, and they laugh and then, pull you forward and bite your neck to drink your blood. And so then, you're going to take an intense consequence there. In Candela Obscura, it might be, because this is a high stakes roll, you're going to take 2 hits to body instead of just 1. In something like Blaze in the Dark, it might be, well, that was a desperate roll and you failed, so you're going to take a level 3 harm, a neck wound. And the consequences flow from the situation, which is informed by the fiction, right? If you are on your feet and you're trying to box with a vampire and the vampire doesn't have a grip on you, that may still be a high stakes roll, but it's less likely that if you fail, they might instantly be drinking your blood. It might be you make a strike roll to try to stun the vampire with a powerful cross, and you get a consequence. Maybe the consequence for that is the vampire swats your hand away and then reaches out and grabs you by the throat and holds you aloft. Their fangs gleaming as their canines extend, right? The consequence then is you are in a lot of imminent trouble, and you have been constrained by the grapple. It may be that the GM decides that they want to go directly to the bite attack, right? It's a high stakes roll. You failed. They swat your hand aside, grab you by your lapel, and then lunge forward and plunge their teeth into your neck. Mark 2 body. So one of the things that can be challenging but can also be freeing about these games that are a little bit less crunchy, a little bit more narrative focused, is that there's leeway. It takes judgment, and often it's useful to have a conversation to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what's happening and what seems appropriate in both consequences and in results of an action. So here I have a note about examples of determining consequences based on the fiction. We've already done for a fight, right? Trying to get yourself out of the vampire's grasp or just boxing the vampire. Let's roll the scene back. Your circle is sitting at dinner with the vampire. They suspect that this person is a vampire, but they aren't certain, and they know that they need information from this person because they are the owner of the foundry where something mysterious happened. And when the circle went to the foundry to try to investigate, they were rebuffed. And so they sought out the owner to try to get permission to go into the foundry and do their investigation. So what they need from this vampire is permission to go into the foundry. That's what they want from this scene. If they go into that scene and one of the characters says, okay, well, I want to make a sway roll here under cunning. I don't have the things lined up to be able to display the sway thing. Let me see if I can do that. I'm going to do this and then this. Here we go. Great. So sway here, right? There's sway. If my character is going to roll sway to try to convince the vampire to let the circle into the foundry, if they have been complimenting the vampire, yes, vampire folklore has shifted and changed, and then there's lots of regional variation as well. Holly, I remember. Let's see what else. I think you shows up as relevant to vampires in some folklore, if I'm remembering correctly, and then there's regional variation in different areas. But I think, yeah, you is common in English lore. Thank you. Your circle is talking to the vampire. They've been complimenting the food. They've been, they've done some other work so that in the fiction, when they are trying to make their ask, when they're pivoting to negotiation, the vampire is already a bit more warmly disposed toward them. The vampire may be suspicious about why they're here because maybe this vampire is involved in whatever supernatural thing was happening at the foundry. And maybe the vampire already intends to trap these people and drink all their blood. But it's not determined. It's not set yet. If you go into a scene knowing that no matter what the characters do, the vampire is only going to respond in one way, that could be tricky. That might not be as much fun, because the vampire might have intentions, but maybe they can be persuaded. Maybe they can be distracted. Maybe that somebody can offer a bargain. So when my face character decides that they want to make a sway roll, I think about what's happened in the scene. I think about what the stakes are. Like, okay, well, they are asking. So I don't know that this is high stakes yet. I think it's normal stakes. I think if they were demanding, or if they were already under attack, then it would become a high stakes roll. But I'm going to judge that this is a normal stakes roll. It's not a low stakes roll because this is a powerful person, and permission for getting into the foundry plays a pretty big role in what's going to happen next and what's going on in their investigation. If they get a full success, then maybe the vampire says, oh, but of course, I would be very happy for my, for my butler to make an arrangement for you to be able to tour the foundry tomorrow morning. And I'll make sure that the foreman knows that you're coming. And maybe then the trap is at the foundry instead of at the vampire's home, because then there's more plausible deniability, right? That's still a success for the party, even if the vampire is planning on doing future badness. If they get a 4 or a 5, the vampire might say the same thing, and then the consequence is different. So the consequence might be that during the conversation, the vampire mesmerizes one of the other members of the circle without anybody noticing. And so then in the future, the vampire will be able to exert control over them. If the roll is just a straight failure, then you might get the mesmerization. You might get the vampire smiling, standing, and then snapping, and then all of the doors slam shut and are locked. And now the group is trapped in here. They're not just having dinner. Now they are dinner. One of the things that I see in like Blades specifically in the GM section and in other Forged games is that you shouldn't take away the group's success in the same roll as they get it. So that means if the group is rolling sway to try to get the vampire to let them into the foundry, I'm less likely to have the consequence of a 4 or a 5 on that roll be, and now they want to eat you immediately, because that sort of undermines what they've gotten, right? Because what they're going to get is in the future, and now they're under immediate threat. And like, so that gets a little bit tricky. I don't want the players to feel like I have pulled the rug out from under them when the dice said that they succeeded. If the consequence is orthogonal, where it intersects what the players want but doesn't directly undermine it, that I think is probably smarter, right? One of the characters getting mesmerized does not stop them from being able to go to the foundry and investigate in the morning. It is laying the seed for future badness. Yeah, I think to Arudinel's comment about narrative games and like coming to a narrative game as somebody who's not already a writer. For me, storytelling is a fairly fundamental human practice. And while some people are more experienced in it in the way that, singing is fairly universal among human civilizations, and then there are professional like opera singers and pop stars and whatever. So I think it's really good practice. I want to encourage people to not feel like they should be intimidated if they're not already like an experienced novelist or, stand-up comic or actor or, oral storytelling expert. Actual play is one part of the field, and it's the one that most people know about because it's outward facing, right? If you haven't played an RPG, you can watch actual play and you have a sense of what RPGs are, but it's not all of what RPGs are. If you are playing a game with your friends and nobody is a professional storyteller, you can still have a great time. I was not a professional storyteller until, depending on what we count as a professional, right? First fiction sale, first novel, whatever. I had tons of fun playing ttrpgs. What I think the challenge is developing your sense of storytelling, developing your ability to maintain a sense of coherence and cogency of the fiction so you can keep track of the things that are going on, and the communication skills to talk through uncertainty or mismatched expectations about what's happening or what could happen. So, third example set here for a stealth sequence. So this is consequences based on the fiction. So let's say that we have our circle of 4 characters who are visiting the vampire, but it turns out there's a 5th member of the circle, the criminal, who, while the group is having dinner with the vampire, is trying to sneak into the vampire's study and investigate. Okay, we're going to look for some paperwork about the foundry, or something about a journal or contracts or receipts or something. And so we might intercut actually between the group in the vampire's dining room and the character that is trying to sneak in otherwise. So if I'm playing the criminal specialty criminal. I don't have all the terms memorized, so I'm just going to double check again. The criminal specialty of the slink role. Slink, beautiful word. So if I'm playing the slink criminal and I'm trying to sneak onto the vampire's estate and then sneak up to the study on the 2nd floor and then poke around, the GM is going to frame the scene for me and say, and that will determine where my obstacles are, right? The GM might start their scene framing for the criminal by saying, you're creeping across the driveway to the vampire's carriage house, and ahead of you, dimly lit, is the vampire's mansion, and you can see that there is a trellis with ivy crawling up it beside the window to the room that you've been told is the vampire's study. So that's a scene framing of specific situation, and the goal is in sight. If I were doing that scene framing, I would probably say something like that, and then say, you've identified 3 different guards on the premises, that they wear, thick coats and have they have clubs at their waist, and one of them has a dog held by the reins. So that's danger, right? There is danger nearby. And especially in Forged in the Dark games, what I have tried to do and tried to move toward is that anytime I'm calling for an action, I want to be clear about what some of the consequences are and why I'm asking for a roll here, rather than saying you just do it. And I'm going to talk about not everything needs a roll later, right? Not everything needs a roll. It's just down here. So if I'm using a sneaky type action here, I'm going to be rolling move, run, dodge, navigate. Is that, let's see. We're going to use hide, sneak, distract, sleight of hand, because move is run, dodge, navigate. This is really more about not being noticed, because I think this criminal is dexterous enough that can you climb up the trellis and get into the window is not an interesting question to me. I'm just going to assume that they can do that because they are the criminal. What is not certain to me is, can they do all of that without being noticed by the guards, without, either having to confront the guards, having to run away from the guards, without the dog catching their scent. So Rudinell says, a survivalist who has been living in the wild for 20 years with wood, some tinder, shouldn't need a survivor roll to start a campfire. Yes, D&D, I'm looking at you. Yeah, I think something that I see in some D&D games is too many rolls are being asked for, especially when the GM knows that the character is going to succeed anyway. Brendan Lee Mulligan in Worlds Beyond Number introduces something that he calls rolling for emphasis, which kind of does some of this, and that's fine. That's a thing that he does it may or may not be useful here. But what is important to me is that in these sets of games, we're going to roll dice less often than I would expect to roll dice in 5th edition, especially because of how combat works in 5th edition, but not just that. In these games, I try to, where I can, look at rolls as something that resolves a situation rather than a particular moment. So it's not, do you land one punch? It is, can you, using your fighting skills, stun the vampire? And part of this depends on what the player stakes as their objective, right? The player says, what I want to accomplish is X. And then the GM evaluates the circumstances and, goes to adjudicate the roll. So if I'm the criminal trying to sneak past these guards and the dogs, get up the trellis and get inside, then I'm evaluating those things and I say, okay, because nobody has noticed you yet, this is a normal stakes roll. It's not high stakes because, as I will say here with consequences, the first consequence for failing a sneak roll doesn't automatically have to be you are spotted and they are on you. This is something that I've really been internalizing with Blades and other games, that it doesn't have to be. And actually, Pathfinder 2nd Edition does a really good job here. I want to shout it out. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there's like 4 or 5 stages for like stealth and discovery, right? And I'm not going to give the actual terms. I'm just going to try to remember them. There's nobody knows you're there at all. There's somebody thinks that there's somebody around, but they don't know where they are. Then there's somebody knows that you're around, but they don't know exactly where you are. Somebody knows that you're there, but they cannot actively see you. And then somebody directly sees you, right? These are levels of notice that you fall under. So if my criminal character is completely undetected and nobody knows that there's an intruder, and I fail a roll, the character might not be directly spotted. I might cut away to the dog going and pulling the person toward where they are. And now I'm putting pressure on the criminal because I'm indicating to them that guards are on their way right now. And so I'm going to give the criminal an opportunity to either try to hurry with greater danger because now there's a guard closer to them, or to reassess and maybe take a different approach. If I go from you're rolling to see if you can sneak in and you got a consequence to you have been caught and there is a guard dog attacking you now, I'm really skipping over a lot of stuff, especially if we look at heist movies and like criminals and stealth in a lot of different types of storytelling. That nuance can be really powerful and fraught with tension. Somebody knows where you are. There is tension there, but it's really sublimated tension. It's another way of thinking about it is kinetic energy and potential energy, right? I hold this phone above the microphone. It has potential energy because if I drop it, it's going to convert to kinetic energy and it's going to fall, right? And then it's going to bonk this microphone. If I'm holding a phone in a really flimsy grip, there can be tension there because I might drop it at any moment. Once you've dropped the phone, the only question is what happens when the phone hits the microphone, when the cell phone hits the mic. Once you've been discovered and they know exactly where you are, the question becomes, will they catch you? If instead I get a 4 or a 5, I might say, okay, you get up the trellis and into the window, but as you close the window, you see the one of the guards and the dog like sniffing at the base of at the base where you were climbing, and you can tell that the dog has caught your scent. That's a consequence. You have gone from nobody knows you're here at all to this dog has identified your scent. And that's going to make getting out probably a lot trickier. And it may even mean that the guards are going to mobilize if the guard trusts that the dog is not just like following a red herring. So I'm raising the stakes for the criminal, but I have not immediately blown up their spot as an intrusion specialist. This is also a way that you can validate the skill of your characters when they're in a situation where they're really skilled, right? Candela Obscura agents, as I understand from the Quick Start Guide, are presumed to be quite competent operators. They're good at doing the things that they want to be able to do. In Blades in the Dark, your scoundrels are all assumed to be quite capable. Even if you have a 0 in an action, you have a pretty good chance of being able to succeed if you push yourself, if you get help, and or if you start in a controlled situation and you get the chance to re-roll at risky if you fail. Because if you're in a controlled situation and you get a consequence, you can basically double down and press your luck by re-rolling at a risk, by seizing a risky opportunity. So I might say, oh, well, this stealth roll is a low stakes roll because nobody knows you're here at all. And then if you fail, I might say, okay, well, you can roll again, but it's going to become a normal stakes roll, not a low stakes roll, because the guards are moving and a dog is going, but the guard hasn't become alarmed yet. The guard is just letting the dog go where the dog is going to go. And so now the stakes are higher. There's a greater chance of immediate danger if you fail because the fiction has moved forward. The fiction always moves forward. There are no zero-sum rolls. The situation in the story should change between every roll. If you get a fail and then you try to do something again, I think it's really useful and helps the story keep moving if you describe basically a fail cycle of a try-fail cycle. If you have your criminal and they get in the window and then they discover that all of the vampire's documents are hidden in a safe. And so the criminal pulls out their lockpick set and they try to roll to break into the safe. If they get a consequence if they get like a 1 to 3, I'm not just going to say, well, you're just not making any progress. It may be more useful and more dramatic for me to say, you start working and you realize that with the tools that you have, it's going to take you like 15 minutes to break this safe. Do you want to keep going? Because in 15 minutes, there's a really good chance that one of the guards or servants inside is going to walk by this room and they might hear you. Or maybe somebody walks into this room. As the consequence, I'm going to say, it's going to take you more time to do this than you thought you were going to be able to do it in. Or as a consequence, I say, some of your tools break. If somebody got a 4 or a 5 on trying to break into the safe, I might say, you break the safe, but one of your tools breaks and it's so loud, the sound echoes out into the hallway. And you know that somebody probably heard you. Or I give the same description and I say, and we cut out to the hallway where a maid carrying a bunch of laundry stops and turns to look at this door. She's absolutely heard you. The latter is communicating more to the players because the thief wouldn't necessarily be able to sense what's happened outside. But maybe I describe it as you are working the lock, one of your pin or like one of your tools breaks, and you hear somebody stop suddenly in the hallway outside. You're pretty sure they've heard you. And that's a little bit of a merger or like a melding between those two options. And it may be that on that 4 or 5, you open the lock, but you've made all this noise. And so now you're on a tighter timer, right? You can't necessarily just filter through all of this paperwork while the group is doing dinner downstairs. I've escalated the stakes, but I've let the character take a step toward their objective, and I didn't undermine the specific result, right? They wanted to get into the safe. You got into the safe, but this thing has happened. This other thing has happened. It complicates what they wanted to accomplish, but it doesn't take their victory away from them in the specific of what they were looking to do. If the character said, I want to open the lock silently and so nobody hears me. If they get a 4 or 5, I might say, well, you can either open the lock and somebody will probably hear you, or you can be silent and it's going to take you a lot longer. So I'm offering a choice, I'm offering a tough choice. Expediency and no stealth, or stealth and a delay. But in any of those cases, the fiction has moved forward, right? I say, on just like a straight failure, I talk about you pull out your tools, you evaluate the lock, and as you get started, you realize that this lock is really high quality, and it's going to take you a long time to break it. The story has moved forward. Character gave their intention, made a roll, and I have described the story moving forward, the fiction moving forward. In a D&D fight, if I make an attack roll and I fail, the fiction advances, but to such a small degree that there have definitely been times when I'm playing 5e and on my turn, I roll and I miss and I roll and I miss and I feel like nothing has happened. Even if in reality that is, my character is dodging and weaving and they're slashing and stabbing, it's then up to the GM on failures to describe the fiction advancing to keep me in the story and make me feel like either my character is competent but unlucky or some other number of things, because it feels bad to miss. It feels bad to fail, especially if it's going to be some time before you get to do the thing, especially if it's something that your character is supposed to be good at. One of the things that Blades encourages people to do, and a lot of other Force in the Dark games follow on that, is consider making the failures about bad luck and bad circumstances more than incompetence, right? The lock being way more advanced than the character was hoping doesn't mean that the character isn't good at lock picking. If I say you can get it, but you're pretty sure it's going to take you a long time, the character is still a skilled lockpick. They're still a good safecracker, but there was a greater challenge than expected. Or I might say, this lock should be no problem, but then when you touch your keys to the safe, there's a flash of light, and a curse is activated. Like, oh, okay, well, this thief was a safecracker. They're not an expert in this other type of thing, maybe. If I establish that they were a thief who knows all about the supernatural and knows supernatural defenses, then that wouldn't feel as good. But, if I'm playing a character who isn't really experienced in the supernatural stuff, but they're a great like a great safecracker, then maybe that's a more appropriate consequence. With my pugilist trying to punch the vampire, I could say you land a textbook perfect cross, the kind of cross that has brought down 200-pound men, and the vampire doesn't move. That's not saying that the pugilist magician isn't a great pugilist. I'm validating their skill and their execution, but I'm saying that the stakes are higher. I'm saying that the challenge is greater. The enemy is more powerful. I'm not taking the hero down. I'm letting the hero be here where they say they are, and I'm saying that the villain is up here, or the challenge is up here. Okay. So all this kind of bleeds into one another, so I'm just going to keep on going. I've described things that are basically combat, but there is no separate combat system in Candela Obscura, in Blades in the Dark, in Genrenauts, in other Force in the Dark games. In Power of the Apocalypse games, there are some games that have a move that's about combat, or they have a set of moves that are about combat. Interesting. That reloaded on me for whatever reason. Okay. So some Power by the Apocalypse games have more specific combat systems. They have combat moves. But in Candela and Blades and Forged in the Dark type games, generally there is one resolution system. It is say what you want to do. The GM pick your action, or in Candela, the GM tells you which action to roll. You decide whether you want to do things to like get more dice in your roll. You roll, and then the GM describes what happens. And that can be you're fighting a group of like toughs in an alley. That can be for you're negotiating with the vampire. That can be you're trying to sneak across the manor grounds and up into the vampire's study. It's all the same resolution system, right? In 5e, skills are this thing, combat is this thing, magic is this other thing. Combat and skills operate pretty similarly, but you don't, a melee attack is not a skill, right? You're proficient in weapons, and attacks work like this. Attacks go against AC, skills go against a DC. There are a lot of parallels, but they are not exactly the same. One of the things that I run into most frequently in conversations and uncertainty about D&D is what's an ability check? Is an attack roll an ability check? Is a skill roll an ability check? Is a saving roll an ability check? Right? Because in 5e there are ability checks, skill rolls, attack rolls, spell attack rolls, saving throws, and other things. And some of them are or aren't also this other category, or like an umbrella category of types of rolls. In Candela and Forged in the Dark games, there are action rolls. In Blades, there are action rolls and resistance rolls and like fortune rolls, and there's a couple more variations, but it's all still pretty streamlined and close together in how things operate. Combat is not meaningfully different in terms of how the system operates. You can get a body mark in Candela Obscura when you're trying to sneak through the foundry because you got a consequence. You know, you sneak through and something falls, and the only way that you can keep this loud, heavy thing from not making a bunch of noise is you stick out your foot and it hits your foot instead of the concrete ground. And so you take a body mark, but you're not discovered. That's not combat, but you're still taking harm. And you could be in combat in Candela Obscura, and the vampire mesmerizes you, and I say, take 1 brain harm, as you struggle to keep the vampire's will at bay. That's combat, but you've just taken you've taken mental damage. So it all feeds back into the same types of thing. I saw people asking about the combat system for Candela Obscura. It's already there. You've already seen it. The system is the system. Say what you want to do. Pick the action. Get some bonus dice if you want to. Maybe get some help from somebody. Figure out if you have an ability that applies to the roll before you roll. You make your roll. Decide if you want to spend a resistance to re-roll some dice. You get your final result, and the GM adjudicates. That's Candela Obscura's system. That's the combat system. It's also the everything else system in terms of resolving an uncertainty, right? Because there are things in Candela that are not that action roll system. You know, you have the Candela resources that you use for like downtime and recovery. So that's system elements, but there's not a roll there. Speaking of not rolling, not everything needs a roll. Only roll if there are interesting stakes. I have a bit of guidance that's Candela specific, but I'll describe the overall first. And I've talked about this already a little bit. Arudinel gave the example of don't make a survivalist roll to start a fire. Reasons you might want to make a survivalist roll to start a fire would be a storm is rolling in, And if you can get the fire started now, then XYZQ. Or can you get a fire started while you're like, can you get a fire started before you get frostbite because you've already been out in the cold for 8 hours, right? It's raining. They have 5 minutes to get it going, as Arudinel says, right? If there isn't a pressure on the character, time pressure or exhaustion or something else, if this is something that they already know how to do, I ask you, why do you need to roll for them to do it? Because if you're asking for a roll, there's the chance that they won't succeed at doing it. And you're going to either need to come up with a reason why they couldn't do it that is external circumstances, or you're going to tell them that they're bad at the thing. You couldn't do this thing that ostensibly your character could be able to do. Right? Like my archer fighter character is trying to shoot an arrow that has like a string tied to it across a 50-foot chasm. And your character has like a longbow and is good at longbows. Why would that need a roll? Oh, well, you're in a torrential downpour. Now you need to make a roll because you have to adjust for the wind. You're going to, this thing is going to get battered. Your fletching is going to get soaked. And so you're not going to be able to control accuracy in the same way. Think about the fiction, and that will give you the context to know whether there is dramatic uncertainty in the situation. John Harper, in the rules and guidance materials for Blaze in the Dark, talks about making a daring action. When there is a daring action, there are stakes, there are immediate likely consequences. A scoundrel in Blaze in the Dark probably doesn't need to roll to like climb up the side of a building and like run along the rooftops. They might need to roll if they're doing that in a torrential downpour. They might need to do that if they are being chased by somebody. They might need to do that if they're trying to chase somebody. Thank you to McNancy for the follow. Thanks for hanging out with us. D&D in practice, as I have played it, as I have seen it, as I watch it in actual play and things like that, there are a lot of rolls that are called for. And a lot of times a character will ask for a roll. Can I make a perception check to see if I notice anything weird here? I understand that because sometimes you want to be able to draw on the fact that that you're really good at a skill. You say, well, I've got a +7 in perception. Can I roll to see if I notice anything weird here? The GMing advice I would give for 5e GMs before we even talk about like narrative-focused games is I would encourage you to encourage your players or to require of your players, tell me what you're doing to then be able to roll that skill. Perception, it may not be too hard. I'm going to look around. I'm tuning into all of my senses, and I'm standing still. So I'm like minimizing all of my inputs except what's happening in the environment around me. And then the GM will say, great, now roll perception. Say what you want to do, and then the GM will tell you what to roll, right? That's how it works in D&D. If you're asking to be able to make a roll, then what I would suggest is field that as the GM as, okay, that's what we're going to. That's 2 or 3 steps down the road. Let's think about the fiction. What are you doing that would call for a perception roll? And then you figure that out, and then we make the roll, and then you describe in the fiction. Because if I say, I want to make a perception check, so McNancy asks, I ask myself, quote, would it be interesting if the PC fails, unquote? And if the answer is no, then I don't ask for a roll. 100% agree, right? When I'm GMing, I will often say, X is not interesting to me, so I'm not going to ask you to roll it. And unless I have some uncertainty that it's an interesting question to one of the players, I will usually leave it at that. Now, I might say, I don't know whether it's more interesting to me to see whether to ask for a roll here or to ask for a roll there? What do you think? And that's me checking in with the players to get their sense of the fiction and where the risk is, where the drama is. So one of the things that's useful, I think, to keep in mind for running Candela Obscura specifically is that with gilded dice, a player could theoretically game the system by trying to ask for a bunch of rolls for low stakes things or things that have no real likely consequences so that they can choose their gilded die and get backdrive points. I would encourage Candela Obscura GMs to constrain that impulse pretty thoroughly, especially given that this is, it's written as a horror game, right? Your character can be really good at the thing if they're spending their drive. My understanding and my interpretation of the gilded die system is, so these are actions that that are kind of like signature skills of your character, and they can kind of replenish their reserves of energy, of moxie, of whatever, by, leaning into that specialty. And the exact details of how the gilded die manifests in the fiction it's not especially clear in the quick start guide, and I don't know that it needs to be. But if I have a character who has run out of all of their intuition drive down here, and they say, well, I want to sense to see, or I want to survey the road to see who has been here. I mean, it's a heavily trafficked road. There are carriage tracks. Like, someone can say, this is what I want to do. And as a GM, you can just give them the information that you think they'd be able to get. If there aren't real stakes for why they would or wouldn't get that information, then you can just give them the information. I would strongly encourage GMs to also not gate critical plot information behind a roll. Where if they get if they get a 1 to 3 when they're trying to gather information, in Blades on a 1 to 3, I give limited information. I think that's what the book instructs and encourages me to do. And so I would do that in Candela Obscura. I might give them a bit of the information that they need so that they can chase that down and then introduce a consequence that is interconnected to that, rather than the consequence is you learn nothing. Because then the fiction isn't really advancing in a meaningful fashion. It does advance, you look around and you can't tell anything, but the story does not progress. The fiction might progress, but the story doesn't progress. So we can think about these two connected, and that push and pull between, does the story advance, does the fiction advance? I'm realizing as I'm saying it is something much deeper to dig into that I think I'm going to put aside for now, because a whole bunch of things can happen without the story meaningfully advancing, right? There's the idea of spinning your wheels in a story. So that would mean the fiction advancing, but the story not advancing. McNancy references Dread. I haven't gotten to play Dread yet. I really want to. I love the idea of the Jenga tower and that you don't have to pull very often, but every time you pull, there's this incredible danger. It seems so cool. So this advice about Candela and the gilded dice also applies to anything else where the characters might want to just keep rolling until the dice say that they get what they want, right? Can I roll perception again? Why can you roll perception again? You've already rolled to evaluate the scene. If something meaningfully changes in the fiction, then it might make sense for a character to be able to roll perception again. If they know something else to look for, or if something has changed in the environment, they have learned something, they've changed their mind or their perspective about something, that might let them get another take on what's happening. Sorry, there's somebody doing reverse on their car beep that's been on and off for the last 3 minutes, and it's really annoying me. So you're going to roll less often, I think, in Candela and in Forge in the Dark games than you might in D&D 5th edition. This will, of course, vary on your GM and your game, right? You may play in a 5e game that has very few dice rolls, not very much combat, and the GM is really thoughtful about when to ask for a roll and when to just give characters information and say, yes, you do the thing. So the difference may be smaller, but in my experience, it's a substantial difference, and so it's worth talking about. So another big difference is that NPCs and monsters don't have stats in most Forged in the Dark games. You know, in D&D 5th edition, we have a monster manual. The monster manual says that this vampire has this much strength, this much dexterity, this many hit points. They're this hard to hit. They have these superpowers that have these mechanical manifestations. My write-up for the vampire in the scene might be the vampire's name, their pronouns, notes to myself about how powerful vampires are in this setting, and then like stuff about their personality and their objectives. That's my stat block for the NPC. Similarly, when you're making monsters for Candela, I don't think that you have to stat them out to the degree of every time an investigator gets hit by this creature's claws, they take 2 harm to body. I mean, you can do that if you want. I don't know that you need to. My notes for a creature that hits really hard might be, this creature is nearly unstoppable, except with overwhelming firepower, and agents should not be able to stand up to it in a one-on-one fight. I might make that note to myself. I might not even need to make that note to myself because I've thought about what this creature is, and I know, based on the thinking that I've already done, that none of the characters are going to be a one-to-one match for this creature. But because Candela is not a game that's focused on combat, in a given scene, this monster might be an obstacle, but they're an obstacle standing in the way of whatever the characters want. What is this monster keeping the characters from being able to do? Is it threatening some people, and so it is directly the threat, or is it an obstacle that stands between the characters and what they want to accomplish or where they want to go? If a monster is attacking a town, the characters don't have to kill the monster to protect the town. All they need to do is get the monster to stop attacking the townspeople. So they can do that by making the monster leave. They can do it by befriending the monster maybe somehow. They could do it by getting everybody out of the town, and so now there are no people being directly threatened by the monster. John Rogers has a really great essay that was published on his blog and then republished on io9.com. And I think the io9 title is something like "Don't Write Action Scenes," or "Why you shouldn't write fight scenes." And the idea there is that rather than thinking about things as fight scenes, think about scenes that have fights in them as suspense scenes, where a big source of the suspense is the danger that comes from the fight. Yes, McNancy, I am going to get to clocks. I think clocks are a great tool to bring to Candela Obscura to handle some situations where you want to be able to adjust some things in scale, especially for a combat, right? If you have a monster and the characters really need to incapacitate that monster, it might make sense to use a clock so that the characters can make discrete action rolls that will make progress toward their success that is measurable in a mechanical fashion and not just a narrative fashion, right? Because I could mentally have a 4 clock for a monster and describe the threat. A character makes a roll that kind of hurts or damages the monster or slows it down. I describe the fiction. Somebody else does something. I describe the fiction. And mentally I know, okay, they need to make 2 more successes. But the characters don't know that, and the players don't know that. There may be times when you want the players to know where they are within a scene so that they don't get frustrated, even if the characters don't know how much more it's going to take to bring down the monster. Clocks are also a great way of introducing dramatic irony. So in a Blades video, this is like a how-to GM advice video that John Harper did. John Harper being the designer of Blades in the Dark. That they described a scene where some scoundrels were talking to a contact and got information, and the contact seemed to be, above board. And then after describing the characters leaving that scene when they were all done, they put a clock on the table that says they see through her lies, her being that contact. Is that clock a red herring? It could be. Like, this gets into like fairly advanced GMing stuff, but clocks, as implemented and refined in Blades in the Dark, and then seen similarly but not identically in a lot of other Forged in the Dark games, are a great tool for measuring progress. They can represent larger threats where every tick is progress here. So for folks who may not know from clocks, I'm going to bring out some clocks. Oh no, there are no clocks in this Roll20. Okay, I'm gonna move this over here, and I'm gonna go find a Roll20 where I actually have clocks. Stand by. I will be pulling up my Valorword Roll20 because I know I have clocks in there. I was on a Roll20 page using the Blades in the Dark kit, but if it had clocks already loaded into it, I wasn't able to see them for whatever reason. Okay, so here we are, clocks. I'm just gonna zoom this down so that everything is fine. Okay, you can see this here. I'm just gonna make it pretty. Okay, so this is what we call a 4 clock. It has 4 segments, and it's a clock like an analog clock. So this is a 4 clock that is empty. I go here, and this is just like how Roll20 stuff works. The Crimson Beast. We're going to have this 4 clock. It's labeled the Crimson Beast, and that's this big monster. I put this 4 clock down on the table to identify the Crimson Beast as an obstacle. We'll notice that this text here does not say, you slay the Crimson Beast. It does not say, you sneak past the Crimson Beast. It's just the Crimson Beast as an obstacle. And what that means is that the players can take any number of approaches. If I was going to do Candela with a VTT, I would definitely want analog clocks. I agree. The clocks down here are a little bit more like that, right? These clocks. And I use some of those for Valorword sometimes. I have a different set of clock images in mind that I would probably want to use if I was doing this. It's a little tricky for me to think about using the Roll20 kit for Blades for Candela because the actions are different, and it would be harder to figure out where to put like the drives and things. Enough things are different. It's a little tricky, but it would probably work in a pinch. I would just have to work with the players to make sure that they're keeping track of everything right. So the Crimson Beast, the first character might say, okay, well, I'm going to light a Molotov cocktail and I'm going to throw it at the Crimson Beast. Cool. Okay. You're going to use move to do this because it's about like accurately moving things through space, and you make a roll and you succeed there. So then I say, okay, well, I'm going to put 1 tick on the Crimson Beast. You throw the Molotov cocktail, it shatters against the beast's hide, and you see, flaming liquor crawl up and down the creature, and it roars and it like shakes off some of the stuff, and you see that, its hide is somewhat burned. I've advanced the fiction in a specific response to what the character was trying to do. I've shown the results of their action. And then I could, with a clock, show that this beast has been, it's 25% handled, right? I might if the character was doing this and it had been previously established that the Crimson Beast was especially weak against fire, I might reward the character for using fire to do that and say, your one action fills 2 segments here. In Forged in the Dark games, there's the concept of effect, that you can have greater or lesser effect, and that impacts how many ticks you fill on a clock. For Candela, I'd probably keep it really simple because Candela does not have a specific mechanical measure of effect in the Quick Start Guide. If the character was throwing a Molotov cocktail and they got a critical success, even if we hadn't established that fire is especially harmful to this creature, I might say you're going to fill 2 ticks on the 4 clock because you got a critical. And that's your additional success, right? You didn't just make progress, you made a lot of progress here. So that's one way I could adjudicate a critical success. Another thing I might do with a critical is, okay, you get 1 tick on the creature and it is flailing and shaking the fire off, and so somebody else has an opportunity, or you have an opportunity to like get some of the civilians safe, right? You get your normal success and I'm giving you an opportunity. So that's another way that you could adjudicate a critical. For clocks, you could also have racing clocks. Catches up. So I have a 4 clock that says the circle catches up. And then I'm going to copy and I'm going to put down another clock and I'm going to rename it. Nope. The cultists get away. Right? So these are racing clocks. So if they start empty, I could introduce, right? So McNancy says I would add a danger clock called the Beast's Final Form, right? Because you can fill the first clock and then introduce a second clock, and that's like having a multi-phase boss fight, right? You thought that you'd defeated the beast, but it collapses. Everything goes silent for a few moments, and then the creature begins to pulsate, and light is coming from within it, and it mutates and its form shifts and it stands back up and it roars and it's changed and it's gotten insert additional description. And now I put a clock on that says the beast's final form or the beast's true form. Great suggestion. If I'm doing a chase where our circle of investigators is chasing a group of cultists, I could express that chase by saying, okay, whichever of these clocks fills first, that's the person who wins this chase, right? Either the circle catches up or the cultists get away. And so the characters are the only ones who roll. So somebody describes something that's going to help them catch up to the cultists. And if they succeed, I put a tick on the clock. If they get a mixed success, I might put a tick on each, depending on the situation. If they get a straight failure, I would probably put a tick on the cultists get away, and I would describe how whatever the PC was trying to do did not let them gain on the cultists, and instead the way that the cultists reacted allowed them to pull ahead. If the characters were to get a critical success on a roll, I might give them 2 ticks on the clock. The thing to look out for here is what happens if you're at 3 and 3 and then the character gets a mixed result, right? They got a success toward trying to catch up, but they also got a consequence because the circle cannot catch up and the cultists get away at the same time. Yes, progress clock versus danger clock is an important distinction, McNancy says. Yeah, so these are progress clocks. The circles progress toward catching up. The cultists progress toward getting away. Filling the cultists get away clock is not overcoming them as a threat in the way that Crimson Beast clock was, because that was an obstacle / danger clock, and these are progress clocks. The Blades in the Dark book has suggestions and descriptions and examples of a bunch of different types of clocks. I'm not going to describe all of them here, but it's useful to think about. You can use them in a bunch of different ways. Just explain what you're doing when you're working with your group so that they understand what's happening. So if we're at 3 and 3 and I get a mixed result, maybe the circle catches up, but some of the cultists get away. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the circle catches up, but your character gets injured. The circle catches up, but they throw the artifact that you're trying to get back from them up into the air, and like a hawk flies out of nowhere, grabs the artifact, and flies off. Where you've caught up to the cultists and you're still going to be able to get information out of them. You can have them arrested or whatever, but this other thing happened. Like you succeeded, but then there was also an escalation. So this kind of both clocks fill in a racing clock, progress clock kind of situation is a edge case to keep in mind and think about how you would adjudicate so that you're being real, you're being honest to the fiction, you're honoring both the success and the fact that there's a complication. The easiest way to do this is to have the complication not be about the cultists getting away, but about some cost of catching up. Rudnell says, or you catch them, but they were the decoy. You got info and prisoners, but you got the wrong prisoners. That's certainly an option. Yeah, a cool thing that I really like about this type of game is that the framework is solid, but leaves a lot of room for the GM and the players to be able to mold it, meld it, and shape it and direct it in a bunch of different directions. It's a very flexible tool set. There are fewer rules, and therefore there are fewer rules to get in your way when you want to make adjustments. In my experience, a more robust and a more thoroughly featured RPG system can create a larger number of edge cases that then become tricky. But the downside of a more rules light system is that there isn't something specific to go to. And rules, like amount of rules, is not necessarily a single axis, like a single axial consideration, because there's different types of rules and different amounts of rules in different ways. Like looking at Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I would say that Pathfinder 2nd compared to D&D 5th Edition, Pathfinder has more rules, but they are quite robust and feel more internally consistent, such that they give me if I'm GMing, they give me a safety net to be able to operate on, whereas in 5e, in a similar situation, for some situations, I would have to make an additional judgment call and navigate that judgment call around the rules. That's part of a deeper conversation about those two games, which is not really what I'm focusing on here. But I want to circle back around to this idea of flexibility as being really important. So I've talked about clocks being your friends, thanks to McNancy's suggestion, jumping us ahead, which worked beautifully. Why? Oh, this is interesting. Only some of this got expanded into this bigger font, right? So that's what's going on. So another thing I saw on the Darrington Press Discord was someone asking about the magic system. The quick start already tells you what the magic system is. The quick start says in the laws of Candela Obscura, or rules of Candela Obscura, rules of magic. People with inherent magic are rare in the mundane world. Many Candela Obscura members interact with magic by wielding powerful artifacts. These items may also reduce, contain, or eliminate bleed. So in the quick start guide, right, on the sheets, there is gear, bleed detector, bleed containment vial. This is magical technology. Some of the other characters will also get different magic items, right? An arcane text, a ward that soaks 1 bleed. Is that it? Magic show gimmick, not really. Small mundane invention. Okay, that's not magic, but we're kind of in this place. As with the other stuff, we start and end with the fiction. If I have arcane tools and I have a 2 in sense, which is the action that includes like attuning and channeling, I could tell the GM, okay, so I have these arcane implements and I have 2 in sense. And so what I want to do is I want to set a ritual circle to be able to commune with the spirit of the dead. Your character may not have a rule that may not have a special ability that says you can commune with the dead. You don't have a specific spell that is speak with dead, right? In the D&D movie, Simon has a magical artifact that will let him ask a corpse 5 questions, right? Hello, Operation Streaming Fist. Welcome. I love the like powerful flame holding fish bit. That's very good. And the like tentacularness is on genre for Candela Obscura. Welcome. So the magic system is not fully spelled out. We don't have Vancian magic here. We don't have spell levels. We don't have full spell write-ups. We don't have here's how many spells you can cast per day. Candela Obscura, being strongly informed by the 19th and 20th century time period, specifically in like the US and in like Western and Northern Europe, as I take it, like those are the influences that I see most readily here. Again, we don't have the full book. In that time period, it's useful to think about what the supernatural beliefs were, right? We had a still fairly powerful like Catholic Church. There were the Protestant Church. We had various folk beliefs within different communities. We had the sacred beliefs of indigenous people all over the world, which were varyingly impacted or marginalized or like demonized by official systems of power, state power, church power, things like that. Spiritualism, mesmerism, the spiritual beliefs, ideas, and systems of that time in the areas that Candela seems to be drawing on are really not like Vancian magic. And the idea of a magic system is a bit foreign to all of those as I understand them. I'm not like an expert in these historical time periods, and so an actual expert is going to be able to tell you better about any of that kind of stuff, and like we'll maybe have some really good advice on how to use the system that exists to describe and talk about that. But the advice I would give us, you know, us being the folks that are listening, that we should all think about, this game is very narrative focused. We're going to look to the fiction. We're going to think about what these characters can do, what it's plausible for them to be able to do, or to for them to have already learned how to do. One thing that I love in more narrative games is for players to be able to kind of assert things that are true for their character, as long as they fit within the existing understanding of the character or are something that everybody's cool with, right? If I have a character who is a stage magician who I've established from very early on as being really interested in trying to learn quote unquote real magic, like supernatural stuff, not just not stage magic. The stage magic is very fun, right? One of the abilities of the magician character is the prestige. Your magic is usually all smoke and mirrors, but you do have one trick you've learned that's real. Roll sense when you perform it, and on a success, take a bleed mark. Circle one option when you take this ability. Change appearance, levitate, summon mundane object, teleport a short distance, throw your voice. So those are the type of magic that the magician can expect to be able to do with a specific with a specific special ability. If a magician character did not have this prestige ability, but wanted to use sense to try to do one of these things, I might let them do it, but it's probably going to be higher stakes. They might have to mark more gear to be able to do it. They might have to do something to set themselves up to be able to do that sense roll, or it might cost them more. And that kind of calls for a little bit of a judgment balance between using special abilities as a hard limit on what characters can and can't do, and using letting special abilities be places where characters can do things even either more easily or to greater effect. In Blades, I had a situation where a magic using character wanted to be able to do something that is covered by or that is enabled by the compel special ability, and the character didn't have compel. And so what I said is, because there's an ability here, you can try to do this, but it's going to be a lot harder and a lot more dangerous than if you had compel. Meaning that special ability in this case is not, can you do this thing at all? It's, you have a level of mastery and experience that lets you do this with a lot less risk and without having to deal with other certain circumstances. There may be times when, for Candela or other games, where you want it to be a hard limit. Only if you have this ability can you try to do this thing at all. And that's fine. Just communicate. So Rudnell says, main thing I recall about that period is powerful magic was vague curses, mysticism, mentalism, fortune telling, etc. Yeah, like it's good to think about the spiritual and supernatural palette that we're operating within, and to use that to guide what is possible for the characters to accomplish, right? If somebody comes in with a character and says, my character comes from this civilization and I want to be able to do this type of thing using sense, then what I might say is, okay, well, I'm down with that. So maybe let's come up with a new special ability that represents this skill and this background that your character has. And we'll delineate some things that they can do in general. And then that gives us a framework we can work within. So some of these last ones I've already hit, so I'm not going to dwell too much on them. 90 minutes is about what I was thinking, so I'm going to talk a little bit about consequences and some of the differences in how I see cognitive load falling between Candela and other fiction-first narrative-focused systems and something more traditional like D&D. So in my experience running Blades and other Forged in the Dark games, harm is not necessarily the best consequence to pick at any given point. In Blades, harm can be soaked with resistance, can be soaked with armor. Harm creates a death spiral, right? If you have a level 1 harm, you take reduced effect whenever that harm would impact your situation. If you have a level 2 harm, you take -1 die on anything that where that harm would be relevant. If you have a level 3 harm, you cannot act unless you push yourself, right? You're basically incapacitated, and you have to make an extraordinary effort to still be able to act. So harm pushes toward taking a character out of the scene and makes a substantive, specific mechanical impact on their ability to engage in the scene along the way. Also, harm is fairly hard to remove in Blades in the Dark. It's varyingly more or less less difficult in other Forged in the Dark games. Like in Genrenauts, the rules that I have, it's relatively easy to remove harm because it's a bit more of a cinematic adventure-y kind of game in tone. It's closer to Leverage in tone than it is to the Dishonored video games. And even the lead in Dishonored, harm is not as much a thing, right? Because it's a video game and you have a health bar. So it's a little bit of a tricky comparison in terms of just touchstones. But I think harm in Blades makes sense for Blades. For Candela, we have 3 harm tracks, right? You can mark body, brain, and bleed. And you have 3 spots in each category. So you can take 1, 2, 3 marks to body without any mechanical impact. If you take a 4th mark to body when all 3 of these are filled, then you have to take a scar and you're out of the scene for a little while, and you use the rules for a scar where you move an action around and you talk about how this person's life and perspective has changed. If you have 2 marks to body, you don't lose any dice. You don't lose any effect. Automatically, the GM might rule that based on the fact that you've taken, a hard hit to the head, it's gonna be a high stakes roll for you to do focus, to try to remember something that your teacher told you, because you just took a hit to the head. And that is the GM following the fiction and using their evaluation of the fiction to inform what they're saying for the specifics of the mechanics of an action roll. So you can have harm work very similarly to blades in Candela if you want to, but nothing in the quick start rules says you have to, right? At least by my reading. This is a little bit more like hit points. Not super all the way like hit points, and the numbers are much smaller. Also, characters in Candela, it's tricky because you could take 9 hits. You could have 3 marks in body, 3 marks in brain, 3 marks in bleed, but you aren't out of the scene. You haven't taken a scar yet. You're beat to hell, and potentially with bleed, like to hell and back or whatever, right? But you're not out of the scene. Now, if the GM just hammers the body category, mark to body, mark to body, mark to body, mark to body, you can take 3 of those in the 4th. On the 4th, you're out. If your character keeps on doing things where the actions that they're trying to attempt could reasonably lead to body harm, and you keep pushing yourself into that as you take marks in body, then you should probably understand that you're setting yourself up for your character to potentially get knocked out of the scene, right? If your character takes a couple of knocks to body and then they're more careful physically and they're trying to stay at the margins and use magic and try to remember things, then maybe the GM is not gonna like pressure you in the same way. They may be less likely to give you marks to body based on other actions. Again, that's going to be a judgment thing. That's a conversation between player and GM kind of thing. But all that said, here are some other types of consequences that I think can be great. And when mixed in with well executed marks to these tracks or harm in blades, can be really great. So escalation. You're in a fight and you get a consequence. One option is you take a hit, mark harm to body. Another option is, the enemy sees what you're doing and grabs your leg and like hurls you. So now you've been thrown and you've landed on your face. So you're prone and the enemy is above you. Now you're in a really dangerous situation. That wasn't harm, that was escalation. You're not immediately hurt, but you're in an even more dangerous situation. And in this way, it's a little bit like the hiding and the stealth thing that I was talking about earlier, where the result of one consequence isn't the punch, it's several steps before that. It is, we're going to heighten tension by bringing danger really close to you, but not necessarily instantly following through. Why is this? So I guess subsystems, it wants to be one word, whatever. So you can escalate, raise the stakes, put somebody in a bad situation. You could lose an opportunity, right? You're chasing somebody down and you try to jump and tackle them, and you just get a 1 to 3. You get a 1 through 3, just like hard consequence. Okay, you jump and you try to tackle this person, and you grab them and they shake off their coat, and you're rolling on the ground and you have their coat, but they clocked you with their elbow, and so you're winded on the ground. They're getting away and they jump on the trolley and they're gone. You've lost this opportunity to catch up with them because they're out of reach. Now, a character could go and get on the next trolley and try to track that person down. You don't necessarily have to lose an opportunity forever. Another option for a consequence is losing resources. You've got your bleed containment vial, and you're trying to be really careful and take this, arcane shard that you've picked out of the occultist's study, and you're trying to contain it so that you can study it later. And for whatever reason, the action that you're making has a consequence. You're getting a consequence where you could lose that bleed containment vial, right? Maybe you already have it. You already have the shard and it's on your person, and then you're in a fight and you take a hard fall. I might say, and as a consequence, the bleed containment vial that you're holding breaks and the crystal goes tumbling from your grasp. If it were an especially high stakes roll, I might say you take a hard fall, but rather than marking body, the bleed containment vial breaks. It stabs into your body, mark 1 to bleed, and the bleed crystal goes clattering out of sight and you lose it. So you lose the bleed containment vial and you take a mark and you lose the thing. That's like a really hard consequence. You could make the consequence substantially less impactful by pulling back each one of those, right? If the vial breaks and you lose the crystal, that's really bad, but you don't take the harm. It's not as bad. If the vial breaks and the crystal goes clattering to the ground, now you don't have your bleed containment vial, but you didn't take the harm and you haven't all the way lost the crystal. So maybe that's more appropriate for a not as high stakes roll. And this gives you so much flexibility, right? When I'm thinking about scenes and consequences, I think about what are the objectives? What are the stakes? So Rudinal asks, that's like if you rolled a 1 on every die. I generally don't make harder consequences for 1s instead of 3s or 2s instead of 3s, because the game says that basically there's a result band and that a 1 and a 3 are mechanically identical. I'm more going to judge the level of the impact of the consequence off of the stakes, if it's Candela, if it's high stakes, low stakes, or normal stakes, or in Forged in the Dark games based on position. If you make a roll in a desperate position, then then the consequences are going to be harsher. And the consequences are going to be even more harsh if you're in a desperate situation against an overwhelming opponent. Because the hit or the consequence that they create on you or they inflict should be more extensive because they're a powerful opponent. And so that can create a little bit of a snowball, right? Where you're in a worse position going up against a superior opponent, and you're going to have a nastier effect, right? I don't get as much effect against an enemy because they're higher tier than me, and I'm in a worse position because I'm outclassed. So that's one of the ways that you can really focus in on and convey the danger and the threat to a character because of a superior opponent. So that's that. Assume competence. In most Forged in the Dark games, the characters are presumed to be skilled operators. You can have a good chance of succeeding at everything, especially with help and pushing yourself. So you have a 0 in the action, but you can spend drive and somebody can help you in Candela Obscura. So you could have a 0 and you spend, 1 drive and somebody helps you, they spend 1 from their drive, and then you have 2 dice right away, which is 2 in an action is the most you can have as a Candela Obscura like pre-gen character, right? So that's a pretty good chance of a success. If you're rolling 2 dice, you have a 75% chance of at least one of those dice coming up 4 or higher, of getting some level of a hit. So these characters can do a lot of different things. Compared to like a level 1 D&D character, a Candela Obscura character should probably seem really competent. Especially if you're playing in like the comedy version of D&D, where level 1 characters are kind of like bumbling nobodies so far. And that's a question of tone. Candela Obscura is written as a investigative horror game, so not so much on the like wacky hijinks tone, right? If we look at the Candela one shot from, well, I guess it's a standalone mission more than a one-shot, linked one-shots, assignment 436 or whatever Taliesin said as the Lightkeeper. The tone there was not wacky hijinks. Augie, Ashley's character, was funny, but the overall tone of the story was not like comedic slapstick. So assuming competence can definitely feed into tone, and so I would keep that in mind. And then the last thing I'm going to say is on cognitive load. So D&D has more systems and subsystems. It's a task resolution system, so every role is determining a smaller amount of fiction, but it does it with great precision and allows you to zoom in and have that high level of detail in the moment. By being more granular and structured, it produces more edge cases that require a judgment call. And so when I think about how much energy I have to put into GMing something like 5e and how much energy I have to put into GMing something like Blades in the Dark, Blades and games like it tend to be more improvisational. I do less specific work in prep. I'm more frequently responding to what the characters are doing rather than having solid or rough guardrails on like, this is the story you need to do. You need to do things this way to accomplish the goal. Varying degrees of rails are not automatically a problem, like the idea of railroading. That's a separate thing. If I'm prepping Call of the Netherdeep, the Critical Role Exandria campaign, I have to learn that material. I refer to that material. I use or modify those monsters. I think about what DCs are going to be. The things I have to think about are different. If I'm running Candela from the Quick Start Guide, I have a scenario to refer to, but there are not numbers in that scenario in the same way there are in Call of the Netherdeep. You know, there's brief write-ups for a couple of NPCs and a lot of other stuff I'm just having to fill in or improvise in the moment. So these require different types of work for me. Narrative games require a lot of flexibility and improvisation and skills at description, especially if you're not using like maps or a battle map. And you have to be able to refer back to and judge the fiction. You have to adjudicate consequences, position, effect, stakes, things like that. So you're using a lot of energy for that type of work, but you don't have to remember what the AC of an Etten is. You don't have to have written down ACs. You don't have to have a whole set of stat blocks. You don't have to track 10 different creatures on an initiative ticker. Initiative is determined by what makes sense in the narrative. So these are different games. They require different work. They have different pluses and minuses because no one game is perfect for everything. Hopefully, this has been helpful for folks that are thinking about or looking to develop their skills in GMing more narrative-focused games like Candela Obscura, Blades in the Dark, Court of Blades, Beam Saber, a bunch of things like that. I think this advice applies to perhaps a slightly lesser degree in some ways to like Powered by the Apocalypse kinds of games and other like rules light games like Honey Heist or Lasers and Feelings, things like that. I think Belonging Outside Belonging and No Dice No Masters games are substantially different, and I don't have much experience with those, so I'm going to set those aside as something that I don't know that my advice here applies as much to. But I've played a lot of 5e, especially in the last year. I have listened to a whole ton of 5e actual play and a lot of interviews and discussions about how 5e operates. And then I've spent a bunch of time playing and running Forged in the Dark games. And so that's where I'm drawing on from my experience. I am hoping that the Quick Start Guide necessarily being really limited is not going to stop people from diving in and trying to play this game, because more people playing it means more people are in a position to be able to give feedback to Darrington Press, which means they can make a better game. And ideally, having a stronger sense of how to GM in a way that's satisfying for everybody means that more people have fun while they're doing it, and then people are enjoying TTRPGs in general, and so they're more likely to keep doing it, to get satisfaction and fulfillment from it, to get friends to try it out, and all that kind of good stuff. So that is that. You can find me on Twitter at Mike R. Underwood. I am still there despite Twitter continually burning down but never being all the way gone. You can support my work by following the channel here or by becoming a subscriber at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. You can subscribe to my YouTube, as I try to type here, at youtube.com/C/Mike Underwood. And you can listen to Speculate, the actual play podcast that I co-host and GM for one of the games of. You can follow that. You can see that on the website at speculatesf.com. You can follow us on Twitter at speculatesf. You can watch new sessions live at twitch.tv/ArvinEleron, which is in the this Speculate command here. And then you can check out the Valorword YouTube playlist with the Court of Blades actual play series that I am running for Speculate. Court of Blades being like a Renaissance, swashbuckling, fantasy, romance kind of game. It's been very fun. It was picked as an early selection for the New Jersey Web Fest, which is a film festival for web series of various types, podcasts, actual play, things like that. And that is all of that. Thank you so much to everybody who stopped by. Thank you to McNancy for the follow and for hanging out and chatting and all your great suggestions. Thank you to Arudinel. Thank you to Triffity Mats. Thank you to Operation Streaming Fist. And I'm just going to scroll through here to make sure that I catch everybody. Thanks to everyone who is here and lurking. Thanks to Kids Are Asleep for hanging out. And thank you to everyone who is watching the Twitch VOD later on, or if you're watching this on YouTube. And that is all of that. And now I am going to go and probably walk my dog, because I think that's about time for that to happen. And where is my ending thing? My ending thing is here. So that's all of that. You can also check out my other YouTube video about the Candela Obscura Quick Start to get all of the information about that. And I would encourage folks who are getting into Candela to also check out Blades in the Dark, as is suggested in the updated Quick Start guide. It is a game that I've gotten a lot out of. Reading the GMing section from this game I found to be really productive and helped me get a sense of this different philosophical approach to GMing for a different type of game. So if you like this, I would encourage you to have this be the beginning of your investigation into ideas about GMing for narrative games rather than the extent. But honestly, if you want to go from here and run a game right away, I'm very excited for you, and I hope that it goes great. So that's going to be that. I'm going to head out. I will be back on Friday with another stream. It might just be a video game stream, or I will still be very excited about RPGs and want to talk more about them. We'll see. Let me know if you would like one or the other. And you can find me on Twitter, and I'll say what the next thing I'm going to do is. And that'll be that. All right. Thanks. Bye.